Well, one of the things I thought we could start with today is one thing that Bruce didn't really talk about yesterday, is that I think in a guiding situation, a lot of times one of the things to think about in terms of casting problems that you have is don't even worry about the caster, but think about equipment first. So I think there's a lot of situations when you get a caster that, and believe me, I'm guilty of all the things I'm going to talk about, but sometimes it's like you think you've got a reasonably competent caster, you've guided this person before, and they just can't cast for beans that day. And then you realize that the rig that you put together for them, you know, is an impossible something to cast. So one of my rules of thumb is usually if I re-rig something for the client, is I make a couple of practice casts with it myself, and sometimes if you have an 18-foot leader with 2 lighted tippet and you put on, you know, 3 split shot and a couple of bead heads and you can't figure out why your client can't cast it, it's like sometimes there's some equipment problems to think through. So some of the really basic ones that I get you to think about, you know, I think probably in a lot of modern guiding we're supplying equipment for clients. So hopefully we've gone through equipment and checked all those possible things that could go wrong. If you're in a situation where the client may rig their own rod, I mean, some of this is pretty dumb stuff, but it's pretty basic. I mean, make sure that you or the client didn't miss a guide. Like, you know, that happens all the time, but make sure that you didn't miss a guide. Make sure that, for example, they didn't put a 7-way line on that 4-way rod. You know, all the equipment things that can go wrong. You find missing snake guides on the rod. You find a snake guide that's got a big gouge in it, and you're slicing a piece of fly line off every time they try to make a cast. So a lot of times just a quick equipment inspection is one of the easiest things to do to make sure that it's actually cast correctly. And again, especially if they're using their own tackle, it's probably not a bad idea for you to do just a quick once over. And you'll see things like, you know, a reel spool that doesn't turn because they dropped it and they've now got a ding in the reel and the reel doesn't turn. I mean, there are a lot of those little simple things, even before you actually get to trying to cast, that might be one of the things that you want to do is do some sort of equipment review. I think another perspective that's a good one, and really one of the things, like I said, I've got a couple handouts I've used for other guide schools, but one of the things about 2 years ago I went back and totally redid it. I think one of the things that is useful, and we sort of talked about it yesterday, but we didn't get to all of this, is that one of the things to think about, again, we're multitasking. I think this is one of those things that, you know, multitasking in fishing guiding is, you know, you get a lot of stuff in your mind between wind and weather and whether the bugs are going to hatch and whether the fish are going to bite and, you know, whether you're going to run into that rock and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things I think that it is, you know, it's sometimes really a lot better to have some of this stuff pre-organized in your head. And I think one of the simplest is that we end up getting about a handful of different syndromes in terms of casting. So one of the things I think sometimes just go into the day understanding what you're likely to get. So if you know your clients are beginners, it's probably not terribly shocking what you're going to have to teach them in terms of casting. So I think there's certain syndromes that we find there. If you're going to get the typical guide client, which is, you know, again, can cast a little bit, but probably just enough to be dangerous. One of the other things that I think Bruce intimated yesterday is that almost every caster in the world, if you ask them to self-judge their casting abilities, they'd probably be, you know, doing that self-analysis and say they're about 3 steps higher on the casting level than they really are. So one of the things I'd get you to think about, so if you're going to get beginners, what are the casting problems you're going to have with beginners?
Tailing loops. Too much wrist.
Well, I'd say probably, yeah, I'd say probably too much wrist. But the typical beginner, again, depending on how you want to try to approach that, and we looked at that yesterday with Bruce, but one of the things that I think you're probably likely to find with the typical beginner is this, okay, which is either all wrist or all forearm, or as I like to say, some unholy combination of the two. But usually what you're getting with that beginner is the rod just flopping back and forth. So we don't get any loop there at all. I think maybe one thing that I would add to what Bruce told you yesterday is one of the easiest ways I think to organize some of this stuff in my own mind, and I think with lots of beginning casters too, is start with one idea. The only place the fly line goes is where the rod tip goes. So we kind of described it in the same way as yesterday. But again, one of the things to think about when we get that typical beginner cast, when they just simply flop their wrist over, again, if we think about the fact that the fly line can do nothing but follow the rod tip, it shouldn't surprise us that if this is the range of motion that we're seeing, again, we're either getting no loop at all or we're getting a huge wide loop that isn't really going to work for us. So how do we deal with that as instructors? So what's missing here? If I want to get a loop? And the rod is doing this.
Pause.
What's that?
Pause, stopping.
Right, there's no stop. Well, it's probably a stop when I flop it all the way over into the ground behind me and then flop it over here. But you're exactly right. So one of the things we talked about yesterday, and this is just a different perspective on the same idea, is that we said that if we want to try to get a loop shape, and again, the only thing I'd maybe add to what Bruce told you yesterday is that sometimes I think lots of casters come into fly casting. We assumed yesterday that you all knew what a loop was. Your beginning casters won't. And one issue that I don't have a perfect answer for is, do you want to teach them about the loops itself? With a beginner, are you going to teach some basic mechanics of casting? I don't think I have a perfect answer for you. I think you're going to have to judge that depending on what the client really wants to do. As Bruce said, sometimes you're going to find a client that doesn't want to understand casting. They just want to get the damn fly out there far enough to catch a fish. So I think one of our jobs as an instructor, that's what you got to figure out. What are you going to teach? Have that plan before you see your client. Don't try to make it up on the fly every single day of your life, because that's going to frustrate the bejesus out of you. So again, just have a plan. I mean, Jackie talked about this morning. She's got kind of a standard routine she goes through. If you know you get a beginning caster, is figure out some plan and introduce the material in a certain way and do it in a way that, again, you've done it enough times, you know what the sequence is going to be. And maybe that's a perfect way to teach the casting, maybe it's not, but at least you've got an organized way to try to present the material. But again, with lots of beginners, expect that you're not going to have any loop to work with at all to start. One thing that Bruce didn't mention, which I maybe should compliment him for, my experience, if you get a caster that's maybe gone on a couple of trips before, they're a little bit past beginner, what's the one thing they've heard about fly casting?
It's all on the wrist.
Yeah. What's that?
10 to 2.
10 to 2.
And it's a
Again,
crunch.
10 to 2,
Yeah.
okay? That's the one thing that they will have heard in a beginning fly casting lesson. Why do we teach casters 10 to 2?
River runs through it.
Well, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
I even have a credit line in that movie, I should probably apologize for that. But, so when we teach them 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, why do you teach a
You're
beginner?
trying to restrict their range of motion
Yeah.
and their casting arc.
Right. My favorite way to say it is because we don't want 9 to 3. And that's literally what we usually get with the beginning casters. You get a big semicircular path of the rod tip, which either creates a giant loop or no loop at all. So in that beginning lesson, you get taught 10 to 2. Now we've got a chance in that range of motion to do two things. One, get the rod to bend. And then the second thing we talked about yesterday is that the path of the rod tip as it comes through the casting stroke, this tip is literally going to describe the path of the fly line. So this is the top leg of the loop. Whatever the rod tip does, that's what the top leg of the loop is going to do. As we talked about yesterday, what we're really trying to accomplish as much as we can is to try to get that path to be relatively straight. We get to the stop on the other end, line straightens out and creates the loop for us. So a few of the things that I always work through, there's really two things that have to happen in a fly cast. You've got to bend the rod, you've got to stop it. Bending the rod creates the straight line path of the tip. Stopping the rod, what's stopping the rod do?
Straightens out the
energy.
Unrolls the loop.
unrolls.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've bent the rod, or loaded the rod, we come to the end of the casting stroke. When we stop it, we force the rod to unbend or unload, and that creates the loop. So there's really two parts to every cast. Bend the rod to get the straight line path of the tip is the most critical part of that. The second part is we have to have a stop in order to unload the rod and create the loop. So some of the beginner casts that, matter of fact, one of the things we talked about in a roundabout way yesterday, but one of the things that is also fairly typical when you get casters, beginning casters on a lawn, is that you'll make a back cast and you'll get a forward cast loop, and then they look at that target out there, and the natural tendency, if you've never cast a fly before, is that you want to throw your entire hand in the direction of the target. So it's not at all uncommon for a beginning caster to get a loop on the back cast, and then try to throw their hand all the way to the target. Again, if there's no stop, there's no reason for the rod to unload and create the loop for you. So here we get a loop, and here we don't. And I know you've all worked through that before. So again, 10 to 2 is one of those ways to try to get a stop in each direction in order to help form a loop. What else do we want to talk about? So again, that's not anything different really than what Bruce talked about yesterday. One of the things I think that came up in talking to Jackie this morning too, that one of the things that there's a tendency, and I think this would, I'm sure Bruce would be able to tell me the exact engineering that goes on here, but one of the things we have this idea of loading the rod and that we get to the end of the casting stroke and when we stop it, that the spring of the rod throws the line out there. Well, it does, but most of the cast comes really from the acceleration that you're creating with hand and arm. Certainly the stop creates the loop, but a lot of that speed that you get of that loop going out to the target is not coming just from the fact that, again, I could take some line behind this and do that, and it would send it a certain distance, but you'd find that spring of the rod is only a small part of it. The main part of that idea of forcing the rod to bend, again, is to get the straight line path. And I thought one thing maybe we should do inside is talk a little bit about taking it maybe on the opposite, since Bruce didn't even mention 10 to 2, but I think since you're going to end up with a lot of clients that end up, again, if they've had any introduction to fly casting, that's one thing they've heard. So it's a useful starting point, but recognize that that's not the whole story. And a couple things that we talked about at least a little bit briefly yesterday. One of those, there's really, I think, two parts here that are the problem. And that is if you stop and think about 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, if we're centered around 12 o'clock, the loop is moving horizontally. That makes sense? These are my ending points at the end of the stroke in each direction. So the path of the loop is basically horizontal, parallel to the ground, parallel to the water. Well, that's fine if you're standing in the middle of the lawn out there, but most of the situations in trout fishing, I don't find you can throw a horizontal loop very well. So one of the things that's fairly typical that we'd want to do is, if this is my back cast direction, it's probably fairly typical that you'd often want to tilt the casting arc. So that I'm going to tilt it this way so that now my back cast comes up slightly, which helps keep it out of grass and brush and all the obstructions behind me. And typically in trout fishing, you're dealing with a target that's not very far away, so that one of the things I can do is actually allow that loop to move down slightly and unroll above the target when I'm going to the fish. That's not 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And again, if that's the only thing you know about fly casting, this isn't going to make sense. But I think it's a fairly common thing that you do. There might even be some situations, pretty rare, where you actually tilt the casting arc the other way, throw the back cast down, forward cast up, although that would be much rarer. The other place where 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock falls apart is what we talked about yesterday, and this I think is really, this is the cornerstone of what I think of as modern fly casting, so I would stress it even more than Bruce did yesterday, which is the idea that you need to be able to match the casting arc. So again, remember our terminology with the casting arc, is the casting arc is the change in angle that we move through during the cast, from the back cast stop to the forward cast stop. So again, that angle, is it a wide casting arc, is it a narrow casting arc, is it somewhere in between? 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock works really well with medium distance casts. So when you get your beginner, let's say you're going to take 10 minutes to cast with them on the lawn before you take them fishing, how much line do you strip off the reel to have them cast?
All of it. I'm just kidding.
Right. Yeah, 110 feet. Perfect. How
Not
much do
very
you strip off?
Enough to where they have weight to throw,
Yeah.
Right.
but not too much that it's uncontrollable.
Right. And that's in a nutshell. We want enough weight. Remember, we're casting the weight of the fly line, so we need some weight past the tip to make the system work, but we don't want that beginner to have so much line that they can't control it. So give me a number.
I always tell people to cast no less than the length of the rod, with fly line, so not including your lead or anything. Like,
And I would
I
probably
say generally speaking, like 10 feet, it's going to be harder because I fish in the Bitterroot a lot, it's a smaller water, and oftentimes people want to shorten it up, and it's going to be harder for you to cast that shorter line if it's shorter than that 10 feet or so than it is for you to cast 10 to 15 feet.
And I would probably go even longer,
Yeah.
25 or 30.
Yeah.
If you're enough of a tackle geek that, when we weigh lines to figure out whether a 5-weight's a 5-weight or a 7-weight's a 7-weight, although, again, the business has changed enough, that's changed a little bit. The typical thing was we weighed the front 30 feet of the line to be able, that was the weight that we matched up with the flex of the rod to make a 5-weight outfit or a 7-weight outfit or whatever it is. So one of the things to think about is that, again, what am I trying to do? I want to create that straight line path that creates that nice loop shape. Well, if I take 25 or 30 feet of line off the reel, and if it's a rod that flexes some moderate amount, the range of motion that you're probably going to go through to get the rod tip to travel back and forth in a straight line, well, probably somewhere around that 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock or 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. The problem is that we don't always cast exactly the same distance. Although again, in drift boat fishing, sometimes that's exactly the key for us as guides, is to find that sweet spot and keep the client that distance away. But again, one of the things that the Nelsons and I were talking about this morning, we guide on the spring creeks all the time, so a lot of times, like you say, it's very short range stuff. And one of the things to think about is if all you know is 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and we look at a fish that's as far away as you are, and I want to be able to make that little short cast, and I make that same 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock range of motion in the size of my casting arc, I don't get enough bend in the rod to flatten out the path of the tip to create the straight line path. So what do we usually get if you try to take that cast, so you cast 25 feet, but you take them to 15 feet? Well, the loop opens up and their accuracy goes away. So let's go to the other extreme. Everybody does it. Maybe you cast 30 feet pretty effectively. You decide you want to be able to cast, I saw this guy on TV. I saw this movie that was made like 25 years ago, and this guy was casting a big, huge, long line. And that looks really cool. I want to be able to do that too. And the only thing you've ever learned how to do, the only thing they ever taught you was 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock? Well, now if you stop and think about it, now you got a lot more load on the rod. So what's happening here is now you force the rod to bend, but when it actually bends with that additional weight, when it straightens out, it's actually going to flex past that point. And again, a dipping rod tip creates what? A tailing loop. So this is one of those things, sometimes when I talk to other instructors, it's like we go through life with our casters sometimes doing fine at 25 or 30 feet, and we try to get them to make a short cast and they can't create a loop and they can't hit the target to save their life. And then they get out to 50 or 60 feet and want to look like a He-Man and throw a big long line, and you throw a tailing loop every single time. Duh. Okay? We should anticipate that that's going to happen. So one of the things to recognize is that, again, that idea of matching the size of the arc to the amount of bend in the fly rod. As we get more and more bend in the rod, we simply need to use a wider arc in order to maintain the straight line path. My mentor was Mel Krieger. A few of you know that. Mel did a casting video a million years ago, and he introduced this idea, I think the first time it was really shown on video. And the problem was that Mel talked about, and he showed it, that short distance cast with an air casting arc, he called it tip cast. The middle of the rod cast was the typical middle distance at maybe our 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock size casting arc. And then did a big long cast, which we'll do out on the lawn in a minute with no hauling, but again, getting a big, huge, deep bend in the rod. As long as we maintain that straight line path of the tip, we can still get good loop formation. And when I first saw that with Mel, I thought, well, this is great. Okay? Mel's tried to explain to the casting public there's no one casting arc that fits every cast. Unfortunately, he's taught them it's three. A tip cast, middle of the rod cast, and butt cast. And the thing to understand is that it's not 3 or 7 or 11 or 39 or whatever you come up with. The fact is it's a continuum. Your job as the caster, and again, this is what I usually see. If I see somebody that I think really understands casting, it's somebody who can pick up a fly rod, throw it 30 feet, and then come back to 12 or 15 feet, cast the same rod, and then check most of the fly line with the same rod. That person's got it figured out. And all you're doing in those situations is matching the size of the arc to the amount of bend in the rod. So the other thing to recognize is depending on the types of rods you fish with. A super stiff fly rod, you're going to use different sized casting arcs than you would with a really soft fly rod. Because under the same amount of load, they're going to bend differently. Does that make sense? So again, some of these things aren't much different than what Bruce talked about yesterday, but I think that's a little different perspective. Most of where he talked yesterday about adjusting the size of the casting arc, which is a very valid point, but I think it's only part of it, was, as you recall yesterday, what he was talking about was that if we're false casting with a certain size casting arc, and then we're going to deliver the fly with, say we're trying to punch the fly into the wind, and now you're going to have to put additional bend in the rod if you hit the rod a little bit harder. The thing he was explaining was that often you'll need to simply adjust the size of the arc on that delivery cast so that you don't create a tail on that last loop. But I'd say all I wanted to introduce here is that there's a lot of other applications for that idea. And I think, again, for at least in my world, the most important part is getting the caster to cast accurately from me to Sean. That seems like it'd be easy, but I think you all know when you work with casters that sometimes, like you say, the short cast is the difficult one. that sometimes the middle distance cast, they do just fine, especially with modern stiff rods. What else would I want to talk about? Well, I think the main things I'd like to do for the group this afternoon, when let's go out on the lawn. The one thing I would really like to do is give you a chance to actually work on teaching. So not just listening to Bruce and not just listening to me, but actually getting a chance to coach each other. The one thing I would like to do is be able to be there to listen into your delivery, so that if I can make any little helpful hints on coaching, we can do it on that level. Are there any, actually, the other thing, it'd be fun just to kind of do this as question and answer. Are there certain things that Bruce talked about yesterday that that you didn't quite get? Any casting problems that you deal with clients on a regular basis that you don't think people have ever explained to you correctly?
I'd just say the biggest thing is sometimes you gotta pick your battles, because casting is one small piece of fishing, and like, it's a fine line of trying to like critique their casting all day without overwhelming them with all the other stuff that they're also trying to do at the same time, with trying to get a good drift and set on a fish, and then fighting a fish, and all that. So it's just trying to like picking your battles and prioritizing what to critique and what not to critique.
Well, I sometimes think too, that's one of the handouts I could send you, that one of the things I sometimes think one of the best ways to get organized is to say, I know I've got never-evers today. I kind of know what I'm going to have to do with casting. Your goals for that day of trying to teach casting are probably, you're not going to set the bar that high.
Yeah.
But let's say there's sometimes differences in guiding situations. You've got a couple of beginners, but you've got them for the next 6 days.
Yep.
In my head, that's a totally different situation than what I might have done before. So again, if I've got them for 6 days, I'm not going to overwhelm them the first day with casting. But again, you can just take off things and try to teach incrementally as you go through. And as you say, not overwhelm them, but keep it fun too.
Mm-hmm.
I think. If you can see, let's just take casting faults. If you see some casting fault they're making on a regular basis, and again, if you give them some cue that, maybe they're not making a stop on the forward cast. So before you ever get in the boat, say, when I tell you, as Bruce's example was, when I say stop, I want you to stop sooner on the forward cast, is what the word stop means. But communicate that ahead of time so that you're not guessing. Because that's, I think, the unfortunate thing is we do kind of get in our routines and we have ways of explaining things. And the only thing I can say is you can have the best way in the world to explain something, and you're only going to get a certain percentage of the audience. So you need to have different ways to explain the same concepts. Most of the casting concepts, I think Bruce proved that to you pretty well yesterday, that really there's not that many variables involved in the casting. It's just getting them all to happen in the correct order at the same time, all that kind of stuff. So again, it's not that you're going to come up with some brand new way to explain it, but you need to make sure that it's clear and concise. One issue that you raised a minute ago is, I think we were talking about, how much do you want to try to teach? You're going to try to teach them everything about the sport of fly fishing on a half-day, trip? Well, no. But again, the things I think that really help fishing guides in the long run, I think in a general way, is feeling like you can have certain goals to teach them certain things, and to feel like you're actually trying to approach those goals instead of just kind of throwing the mud at the wall and trying to see what sticks and doing it differently every single time you do it. Always working for a better way to do that, which is why I love to do these kinds of things, because I always learn a lot more from students than students ever learn from me. So that's a lot of the fun of that. When I hear a new way to describe something I've tried to describe 100 times, I like to say in other guide schools, if you're not stealing ideas from other guides, you don't really understand the job description. If somebody has a better way of doing it than you do, you damn well better pay attention and adopt it, or at least modify it to use it for yourself. I think one of the other things that I would get you to think about, just in terms of, so if you want to be a better casting instructor, what are the things you want to do? Well, I'd say the first step is improve your own skills. Keep casting, become a better caster. It doesn't, just like, as we all know, you don't have to be the world's greatest angler to be a good fishing guide. You don't have to be the world's greatest caster to be a good casting instructor. But you need to understand the fundamentals. And I think one of those things that will make you a better instructor is just to continue to work on your own skills. The second part of that, I think, is, where's I going with that? The one thing I would tell you to do, as I said, the only way you get better at teaching casting is to do a lot of it. So any opportunity you get, like I did with these 2 days, anytime you get an opportunity to actually do it, you're going to get better as you do all those things. The one thing that we kind of came back to a minute ago, we'll go through Bruce's 6-step method. As I said, I think for the most part, when you stop and think about it, that kind of analysis is what has to happen if you're going to teach casting. It's figuring out what the casting fault is, figure out where the casting fault comes from, and then see if you can figure out some way to solve it. The 6-step method is great just because it makes it very straightforward, as Bruce was lecturing you yesterday. Don't skip any steps, but go through that process enough times until that becomes very, very natural. And that, again, looking for the casting fault, if there's a problem with the casting, what's the line doing that's not correct? What's the rod doing to contribute to that? And what's my caster doing that's creating the problem? And then, again, to go from the bottom to the top back up, figure out what the caster has to change, hopefully communicate that clearly. Hopefully then the rod will do at least a better thing, if not the correct thing, and then eventually we get improvement in the fly cast. The one thing that means is that you need to get really good at analysis, and you need to be able to do it quickly. And I think the one thing I've always described is what I think of as the 30-second drill or the 1-minute drill. Every single time, this is how I'm going to curse you for the rest of your life, because from now on, every single time you see a fly caster with a rod in their hand, I want you to stop and do analysis. And for fishing guides, I come out to the spring creeks. It's like on a busy day on the spring creeks. It's like I'm not paying attention. I'm not paying attention to my client 100% of the time. But it's like, tie a fly on, they make a couple of casts, and it's like, let's see, if that guy were my client today, it's like I look at him for 30 seconds, like what would I have to fix? What's the first problem I try to fix in that caster? And sometimes you look at the really good caster and say, boy, I sure wish I had that guy today, not my client. But that's the thing. I think every time, you show up at a boat ramp, you're rigging the boat, you're putting, getting the oars and the anchor ready, and you're doing all that stuff. And there's always that 3 or 4 guys that are wade fishing around. That's all I'm usually doing, is like I'm putting the anchor on. It's like looking at somebody's casting. So looking at other casters and getting in that habit of, again, as Bruce said, one of the things that'll make your life a lot easier is look for the top leg of the loop. That's kind of where the magic happens. So it's, if the top leg of the loop is in good shape, you're probably doing pretty well. Where's the top leg of the loop come from? It comes from the tip path. So for me, the whole thing that casting hinges around, if we want to create the loop, the one thing that we have to do is be able to create that straight line path at the tip. To me, that's kind of the core idea that I kind of base my teaching around. But practice, that's really the main thing I tell you, is practice doing the analysis, practice doing instruction. I guess maybe to get back to one thing that you mentioned a little bit ago too, is that sometimes, you're not going to build Rome in a day. So figure out what your goals are. Just have a goal. It doesn't have to be a lofty goal, but I think sometimes going into the day with a goal for what you want to do with your client not only will probably make you more effective, but I think also keeps you from going crazy. Well, I think the 2 things I'd like to do for us today is let's get some rods in hand. One thing that Bruce didn't really talk about in any kind of detail, and I think we've got enough of it to work with, is let's talk about wind, because that's, I think, again, that's one of those things that we have to deal with on a daily basis. We can talk a little bit about casting in the wind, and then give you guys a chance to do a little bit of analysis, and while I'm around to observe you. So let's grab some rods and head outside and do that.
I always ask classes, where's the one place on a windy day where it's not really windy? I used to say from here to the ground. Yeah. And I did this clinic with Bruce, and he walked over to me, grabbed my hand, and there. So one of the things that is true, one of the things you've got, the one place on a day, even like this, where we've got lots of wind, the place where we've got the least amount of wind is going to be very, very low. So again, just where that air is moving across the curricular, almost like the water on the bottom of a trout stream. That's slowing down the wind velocities down here, so that's helpful. At least to know that to get started. So let's talk about all the various things that can happen with wind. So one they can have, which is what I've got here, is headwind. So what am I going to do to try to deal with headwind? Right. So one thing, again, the less wind resistance we've got in the wind is going to be good. So a well-formed loop, and hopefully a relatively tight loop, a relatively narrow loop, are both going to help. The other thing that's going to help is not to try to fight too much of the wind. So if I've already said my target's out there and I know that there's less wind down here, what can I do to try to minimize the amount of effect the wind is going to have? Exactly. So again, coming right back to what we just talked about inside, one of the applications of that idea, that being able to move away from that idea of 10 to 2 where you're always casting horizontally, that one of the applications here is that I can tilt the casting arc forward so that my forward cast is going to go lower. Back cast, again, it's going to be wind aided on my back cast, so I don't care if I throw it up in the wind on the back cast. And then I'm going to concentrate on loop formation in front so that I can hopefully get that thing to turn over right over the target. And that's one of the ways to get down. Any other ways you could do it? Good. So Josh said one thing you can do, although this is definitely not my favorite way to approach it, is the other thing you can do is literally cast sidearm and get the entire loop to take place underneath most of that wind loss. The problem I find with most sidearm approaches to casting is accuracy. So that's the biggest issue I see with any caster that wants to cast way out here to the side, is you've lost the ability to be able to just look directly at the target. You know, I'm a traditional archer too. One of the first things you said the first day was something about picking a spot. So it's a lot of the same sort of thing, that if I'm going to be able to get the fly into the correct place, the thing I need to be able to do is think about where this is. If I'm moving all the way over in here, you know, my line of sight to the target and the direction the loop is going to the target are not only different, they're you know, totally divorced ideas. So with enough practice, you can get good with that sidearm delivery. My favorite analogy is, you know, a pitcher that throws a sidearm fastball. That's great when you see somebody can make that really knuckle-dragging delivery and throw strikes, but that guy had to throw a lot of baseballs in his lifetime to get good with that. If I hand a beginner a baseball and say, you know, put it through the window over there, I think you're going to come a lot closer on that initial try is if you pretty much throw it down your line of sight. So again, my thought on that is that at least with beginners, I don't want to be doing too much of this stuff if I actually expect them to hit any kind of target, because that takes a lot of practice to be able to do that. Again, the thing I would try to get you to think about doing is higher back cast, lower forward cast, and try to get the loop to literally turn over right above the target and fall. How about the other way? As most of you know, even though your clients don't ever believe this, but casting with the wind is, I think, about the most problematic situation you can have. But it's one of the things I love to do in regular guide schools is I'll have a bunch of students, they'll say, okay, just spread yourselves out on the lawn. If there's any wind at all, they always set themselves up with the wind at their back. Like, well, you got a forward cast and a back cast, and one's going to have to go one direction, one's going to have to go the other. If I've got, you know, if we were fishing the pond and a headwind, I would much rather have the wind in my face than have the wind at my back. I mean, if you're fishing guides, you know what that means. It's like when you got that strong wind at your back, they make a crappy back cast loop. The wind pushes the entire thing halfway back to your back in the first place, and then they come through the casting stroke with no tension until they get halfway through the stroke, and then they hit all the tension, and the rod tip dips down. And now where's that conehead woolly bugger? Headed right to the back of your neck. So again, you've kind of conspired against you in that case because they're not looking at the back cast. So a lot of cases that means they're not even aware of what they're doing back there. So you kind of chuck it back there, you come forward, you hit a tailing loop, and almost, you know, invariably you're going to have that fly in your back. So I find this actually to be sometimes the most difficult cast to make well, is when you've got the wind directly behind you. So what am I going to do in this situation to try to deal with the wind? One application of the Belgian cast. One thing we could do is just do the opposite of what we did with the headwind. So this is one of those situations where I could actually try to drive back cast loop low and then throw a higher forward cast and allow the wind to carry the fly out. If you're in situations where you need a lot of accuracy, that's not going to be as useful, but probably some lake fishing, streamer fishing in some situations where you're really just trying to cover water, then that can be a really effective way to do it. Let me get to the Belgian cast when we start dealing about. So headwind, tailwind. Now I'm a right-handed caster, so if the wind is coming from my left side to my right side, not too much of a problem. A big gust of wind catches my boat, it's going to move in that direction away from me, so I don't have to worry about getting hit. Usually do that. We've talked about Kentucky windage a few times, but that's exactly what you're going to have to do. If the wind is pushing you strong across your line of sight, one of the things you're going to have to do is simply make the adjustment to try to get it enough into the wind that you can get the fly to the target in the first place. The horrible one, and the one that probably we all dread the most, is for a right-hand caster to be starting, having that wind that's blowing from the right-hand side into your left-hand side, because now the loop is going to get blown into your body where you have to worry about it. Even if there weren't a guide involved here, you'd still have to worry about it. Now you guys are involved. So what do you see clients do when they get that strong wind coming from their casting side? What I usually see is they just keep trying to stick the rod farther and farther away from their body to keep it away from them. And again, with a big strong gust of wind, you're not going to be able to move it far enough away from your body to keep yourself protected. So one of the things that we can do, one of the things you could do is learn to cast left-handed, which is actually one of the great applications for being able to switch hands. Is if the wind direction is wrong, you can just go to the opposite side. But one of the things that Jackie pointed out to me a minute ago, one of the things that we can do here is if we want the cast to take place on this side of my body, but I'm still right-handed, again, depending on the grip that you use, that's a really easy thing to do, because all I have to do is rotate my grip. And now the rod tip is on the left side of my body, not on the right-hand side of my body. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. We'll come back to this, but one of the things that you can do here is that I can actually come across my body with the cast, so I actually cant the entire rod across my body to move the tip over my left side. What I would tell you, what I think, although it requires some practice, I think the better way to do it, again, not to come across your body with the rod, but simply to rotate your grip from here to here. And again, with 9 feet of fly rod, I've moved the rod tip over 3 or 4 feet from where it was in this position. The thing I find, if you get a little bit of practice with this, again, this is going to be really useful in wind, but the off-shoulder cast, I think for a lot of what we do around here, the biggest application, and I know we've all been through this, you get a right-handed caster, they're in the front of the boat, they really like the left-hand bank. Because you can make the cast from the front of the boat, you're not casting across the boat, you're not going to whack the nice guide, and you're not going to whack your companion in the back of the boat, but you can cast really comfortably here. And then you move the boat to the right-hand side to hit a right-hand bank, and what happens? Everything goes to hell. That's exactly right. And most of the time, my analysis of that one is what most people tend to do, again, when they want to try to cast to this side, is now they do this cross-arm, cross-body cast. And if you stop and look at it, the thing that I find most of the time when you make this cast across your body, think about the size of the casting arc we're now creating. And what I usually find is the caster that was reasonably accurate on the left-hand bank, you move to the right-hand bank and they can't come anywhere close to the target. One of the first things I usually teach people, again, intermediate skill levels, is from the front of the boat. Again, the thing I would get you to think about doing is, again, not this, because I think in most cases the problem with that is now you've opened up the sides of the casting arc, typically your loop goes away, and now if there's any breeze, your accuracy is totally off. What I'd get you to think about doing instead, again, is just do that rotation of your grip to here, so that now I've got the tip on the left-hand side of my body. I find with most casters, at least my experience over the years, is that most casters are much stronger doing this, keeping the hand and arm on the right hand, again, I'm talking about a right-hand caster, but keeping it on the strong side of your body actually is much more efficient than trying to make the cross-body cast. And I know we often deal with this. This is one of those things that sometimes I talk in other guide schools about this. One of the things that sometimes you might do if you get a beginner client and they're going to be on the front of the boat, well, I might fish a lot of left-hand banks the first half of the day. One of the things that I'll tell you, I think in terms of all instruction, but certainly probably in other guiding too, Tucker and Jackie and I talked about this, we don't have to tell them everything there is to know about fly fishing the first day, but the one thing I hope we don't do is I hope we don't lie. Don't tell them something on your first day that makes your life easier that's going to screw them up down the line. And I think sometimes if you're willing, this is one of those things that, you take that beginner and you go down the left-hand bank all morning, I'd probably say something to them. You'll notice that we're going to fish left-hand banks this morning a lot because it's going to be easier for you to cast that direction. Okay? That's all I had to say. It was truthful. I kind of told them what we're going to do. And I didn't tell them that all the fish live on the left-hand side of that particular river. But again, sometimes, I guess my favorite pet peeve, as you probably would figure out by now, is 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I think the people that take a first beginning lesson and that's the only thing they learn about fly casting, and somebody tells them that's all you got to know in order to be able to fly cast, well, that's an out and out lie. You know, there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more to the system than just 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. What I tell them is that maybe at the end of that lesson, if I accentuated the 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock idea, at the end of the lesson, just say, well, that, you know, that idea of 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, that really helped us get some casts out today, but there's a lot more to it. So the next time we get together, we'll talk some more about casting. Just let them know that you haven't shown them the whole thing, that they don't know everything after that first casting. So left hand, right hand, again, the thing that I get you to think about, this is something I'll get all of you to practice a little bit, and some of you may already do this anyway. One of the things I would get you to think about in terms of grip, and one place where Bruce and I probably have a few beers to discuss this with, but one of the things that I find is I don't always cast with thumb directly on top. One of the things that I find is probably, again, my mentor was Mel Krieger. One of the things that Mel talked about in some of his earliest stuff was his favorite grip was what he referred to as the extended finger grip. So I told him later if he'd ever been a fishing guide, he would fully understand what the extended finger grip really looks like, and it wasn't that. But the thing that I would get you to think about, and this is probably particularly true of beginners, and I mentioned a little bit when Bruce was talking yesterday, he sort of described it as the suitcase grip, and I got a funny feeling in my stomach when he said that, because what I see with a lot of people when they do the suitcase grip, it's this. It's the clenched fist around the rod, especially with kids, because their hands are small and the grips are usually too big. The one thing is about the only way they can grip the rod is to do the clenched fist around the rod, and then usually those same beginning casters, especially kids who don't have a lot of hand and arm strength, when they try to cast, the rod just flops around in their hand. What I'd get you to think about, again, Mel's idea with the extended finger grip, which he later renamed as the key grip. So until electronics gets rid of all keys in the world, this is a pretty universal thing. So how do you grab a key to stick it in a lock? So the idea is that you've got your fingers extended along the grip, not in a clenched fist, but having the extended fingers. The thing I find that's really useful for that is, depending on the size of the casting arc, that one of the things I find is when I'm casting a relatively short line, I do have my thumb on top of the grip, right in here with a fairly narrow casting arc. One of the things I find is that if I'm trying to make a longer cast, I think Bruce described it, if it doesn't feel funny, you're not doing it right. Well, I might think if it feels funny, why does it feel funny? I think sometimes when I've moved my hand out to the side of my body to make a longer casting stroke, if I'm keeping my thumb up on top out here, that feels really unnatural to me. So a lot of times what I actually get is more thumb on top here with a fairly narrow casting arc, out in here for a little bit wider, and I will have my hand out in here. The thing that we talked about yesterday, the danger if you start getting the rotation while you're casting, so that if you get this, now I've got a curving path of the tip and I've got a curving path of the line. But if I can do this and keep everything in plane, even if I've rotated my grip out a little bit, that's another option for you. So just another thing to think about as you go through these various grips. But again, one of the great things about that extended finger grip is that it makes this change from my right shoulder to my left shoulder. It's just a matter of rotating. Now I've got more palm facing out on this side. I come back into here, I've got more thumb on top of the grip. So again, that's one thing I'll get everybody to practice a little bit. So we talked about headwind, tailwind, crosswinds, Belgian cast. So let's get back to that. One of the things that, I can't remember how much of this we discussed yesterday, but one of the things, this is really useful, especially with heavy flies, because one of the things that we can get with the Belgian cast, one of the things to think about with heavy flies, Bruce talked about it a little bit yesterday, of actually changing, rather than trying to get that really fast straight line path of the tip, where that heavy fly is going to go out and bounce. And as he said, a lot of times it's not only going to have enough momentum to carry it, to get it to extend, to get it to lay out for you, but the problem with that heavy fly is you reach the end of the system and that fly has enough momentum to kick it down and create problems for you. So one of the things that we can do here is, rather than trying to make the line move at absolute maximum speed, one of the things that I can do here is I'm going to try to separate as we've talked about the formation of the loop, most of the time, we talked about this yesterday, is that not maybe having the rod exactly vertical, but having a little slight cant so that the loop can unroll next to the rod. One of the things that we do at the Belgian Cast is we make that even more extreme in separating the loop, so that on the back cast, I'm actually going to swing it up. So some of you that have done some two-handed casting, some of this stuff will start to look familiar, because what we're actually doing is trying to actually sweep the line up that throws it there. And again, with that heavy fly, as you make that upward sweep of the rod, that's going to kick the fly up high. And then I can make an overhand cast and put it back down. For heavy, bulky fly streamer fishing, a lot of times this is going to be one of the best ways to get control. And again, rather than trying to maximize all of the speed and all of the momentum through the whole system, which we normally do if we're going to throw a floating line with a dry fly, because we've got that fatter line that's fairly wind resistant, we need that maximum speed to get the loop to tighten down and to move at maximum speed. If I'm trying to flop a streamer out 30 feet to the bank, I don't need all that line speed. I've got enough momentum in the fly. Again, I can sweep it up, swing it over, and it keeps everything under. Some of you may have heard there's oval casts and constant tension casts. The idea that with this cast, I can almost just swing this thing around, and there's not as much acceleration in the system. I'm just kind of keeping that thing out there where it can't whack me. And then when I'm ready to deliver the fly, then I just come over and deliver the fly. But again, and I'm not going to hold the line in the air for all those casts, but again, it's one of those ways that you can make that initial pickup. Bruce went through the idea of, if you're using a sink tip or a sinking line, be able to roll cast it up to the surface so you can pick it up, and then that, and boom, just get the fly back out there.
A little safety note though, if you're trying to use the Belgian cast, really gone awful right-handed caster, if you're fishing a right-hand bank, you're asking for it. Because that thing is coming really low, and it's about that height.
Well, and a right-handed caster on that side. Again, just bring it off the opposite shoulder and you can do exactly the same thing. What other Q&A do we want to do? Are there any other things that you struggle with clients that?
So,
Yes.
I'm the only
Thank
one
you.
that, yeah.
Thank you.
How about describing a parachute cast?
Depends on which. There's 2 or 3 casts that sometimes get referred to as parachute casts.
Okay, like a puddle up, a parachute downstream, building up the line to go downstream further.
Okay. One of the things I'd say was, so we sort of start with, straight line casts as our basic presentation cast of just. One of the things my old mentor Mel Krieger used to say is, don't forget a straight line cast is a presentation cast. So sometimes I think that's one of the things we all struggle with, but sometimes before we try to get to the trick and fancy roping, sometimes it's better, why don't we just try to get the fly to the target first? So, some of my favorite fishing stories revolve around that, like, should we change the fly? Well, why don't we let him see this one first? That kind of happens to us on a daily basis. So again, sometimes it's just, if we get the fly and the fish can see the fly, good things eventually happen, okay? A lot of other things could go wrong. If the fish actually has a chance to see and take the fly, that we've at least got a fighting chance. If the fish never, if our accuracy is so bad that we never get it there, well then all the presentation casts in the world aren't really going to help us. So let's start
a little bit more advanced than your average angler.
And that's exactly right. So I think one of the things, we talked about, you're going to have to do the analysis of when you want to try to introduce some of these ideas. You're not going to take the ranked beginner and show them 3 or 4 different presentation casts in their first day of fishing, but building some of those in. One of the things to think about, again, in terms of how loops really work, think of what the best angle is going to be for this. One of the easiest ways to do, again, parachute cast or a puddle cast, one of the things that we can actually do is purposefully, so if we've got a target that's in this direction, one of the things that we can do is actually drive back cast loop down, forward cast up, because if you stop and think about it, if we get the line and leader to extend this direction, when gravity takes over, it doesn't do that, it does this. So again, just a higher forward angle is one of the ways that you can build additional slack into the cast. frankly, the reach cast that we talked about a little bit yesterday, I just find most of the time, all of the other presentation casts that you see described in the books and the videos, I don't know how often you guys use them, but I don't really use them all that often. So things like the wiggle cast or the S-curve cast, it's really fun to demonstrate it, but I don't find it to be a very practical fishing cast because you can't really control which direction each of the wiggles go. And my, again, just throwing uncontrolled slack on the water, to my mind, doesn't really get us very far unless we've got an ability to strike the fish if the fish actually takes the fly in that situation. So I guess puddle casting, a little bit like, well, one of my favorites used to be a negative curve cast, but curve casting is stuff that we can talk about. I don't think probably in the context of warriors, those casts are going to be things that are probably going to be that important to us. And I even find, we fish the spring creeks all the time, and I don't find that I try to teach curve casts all that often because I don't really get casters that are able to execute those casts effectively enough to really make a difference in their fishing. So I still think probably the best way to introduce controlled slack is either upstream cast with good bending or a reach cast. And I just find usually reach casts is, you guys aren't going to strip naked and get in a sleeping bag or something.
You're not allowed. Feral woman.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Well, I think there's situations where you stand will present the need to do a puddle cast versus a reach cast.
Like what?
Sometimes.
Place that I found to use a puddle cast is like when you have a slick and really fast water right next to it.
Right.
So you need like that, I don't know, like 3 seconds of your line is right there.
And you know exactly where the fish is. You see a feeding fish, you know exactly how much line you need to be out. So it's not going to go past him and then, or, you're not going to get a hit in front of him that you're going to be picking up a whole bunch of slack. So you can judge that distance, and you've got different current lines, and you've got, I guess it's a very
Specific
yeah.
situation. Well, I think two things. I think what I see more guides use than probably really a puddle cast is what I call a check cast, which is to overpower the cast slightly so that it bounces.
Right.
The whole thing extends. You overpower it slightly.
That's
it
exactly
extends.
what I'm saying is a puddle cast, but I really mean like I am just bouncing it back a tiny bit,
Right.
so that it lands and floats in front of that fish.
And all that really requires, I think, to be honest, again, that's one that requires a little bit of practice. It's just making sure that everything in the system is moving fast enough that it actually turns over fairly quickly and you'll get the bounce. The two things that will actually add to the bounce, which I'm guessing what you're thinking of in terms of scenarios, it won't help you much, because two things will actually help you with the bounce. If you wanted to throw curve casts, which I don't think we'll bother with today, but one of the things if we wanted to throw curve casts, you'd find that a relatively stiff leader and a relatively bulky fly are the two things that actually help you make the bounce. So I think that's one of the things that I find that's really interesting compared to what I learned when I first started learning how to cast a lot of curve casts and stuff. One of the things that we've actually done that people don't talk about much is that with modern monofilaments, we've made modern monofilaments soft enough, which was the whole idea, right, was to get them limp enough that we could actually get some movement of current without necessarily dragging the fly. But we've also got materials that are limp enough that if you're trying to do the sort of stuff we're talking about, we've also almost made it where it's impossible to have enough tension in the system to be able to kick the fly left and right. So I think it's one of those things that, again, if you want to be able to do that stuff, you probably have to shorten up tippets, and if you went back to throwing maximum leaders, you'd find those curve casts are a lot easier. But modern monofilaments, we're kind of trying to make the monofilament do some of the job of presentation for us. But I think those softer monofilaments make it harder sometimes to be able to do that. Well, let's do something that'll warm you guys up a little bit. Let's do a little bit of casting.